This is a piece titled Between Opposition and Denial, Radical Responses to Anti-Semitism in Contemporary Europe. It's by Robert Fine. There's a book by Robert Fine called, I forget what the hell it's called. I think it's like Marx, Rule of Law, Marxism, or Marx, Democracy and the Rule of Law, or something like that by Robert Fine. I have some other pieces by Robert Fine as well on here. One's about cosmopolitanism. I'd encourage checking those out. Yeah. Robert Fine also had a piece in one of the Open Marxism books. Anyway. There is an enigma concerning the left in Europe today. How can it be that a political current committed to anti-racism in general and to combating anti-Semitism often finds itself hostile to the actually existing critique of anti-Semitism that goes under the name of, quote, new anti-Semitism theory, end quote? Why this subdivision into political camps? Why has the question of anti-Semitism become the shibboleth whereby past political allies have become firm enemies? The common belief that many of us have expressed, sometimes under the unsatisfactory title of, quote, new anti-Semitism theory, end quote, is that a discriminatory logic has taken hold of significant sections of public opinion in Europe and America. Israel is depicted as a uniquely illegitimate state. Zionism is depicted as a uniquely noxious ideology. Supporters of Israel are depicted as a uniquely powerful lobby, and memory of the Holocaust is depicted as a uniquely self-serving reference to the past. The fear we have expressed is that behind the, so to speak, critique of Israel, what is actually happening is a reconstruction of old anti-Semitic motifs in a new guise. Blood libel, global conspiracy, secret power, indifference to the suffering of others, exclusive concern over Jewish interests, radical evil, and so forth. Our alarm over the rise of this discriminatory logic is intensified by the range of political forces that seem to subscribe to this logic, which include not only fundamentalist parties in the Middle East and ultranationalist parties in Europe, but also sections of liberal and radical European political opinion. Our growing concern is that these otherwise conflicting political forces might unite around hatred of Israel, just as opposing political forces unite around hatred of Jews in the past. So what is it that makes our approach to confronting contemporary anti-Semitism into an object of such deep suspicion for a left that avowedly opposes anti-Semitism as part of a more general anti-racism and is avowedly self-reflective about its own capacity for racism? Let us begin by listening to what our left critics say about us. They say we exaggerate the extent of anti-Semitism in Europe and obscure the existence of much worse forms of racism, including racism against Muslims, Roma, black immigrants, and others. Our critics say we attack the very conceptual framework that will allow us to see other forms of racism, including the whole vocabulary of, quote, Islamophobia, end quote. They say we accentuate the problem by stigmatizing whole categories of people as anti-Semitic. Muslims, Arabs, the left, liberals, Europeans, all who dare from their point of view to question the actions or existence of Israel. They say we are close to manifesting our own racism when we, quote, otherize, end quote, quote, otherize, end quote, anti-Semites in this way. They say we misappropriate the history and memory of the Holocaust by privileging the suffering of Jews, as if only Jews have really suffered, and they say we become indifferent to suffering other than, quote, our own, end quote. They say we invoke the charge of anti-Semitism for dishonest reasons, to defeat criticism of Israel, and that we thereby debase the language of anti-Semitism itself. The very raising of the anti-Semitism question can begin to appear illegitimate. a covert way of expressing a politics that cannot be overtly justified. The first thing I would reply to this often impassioned critique of our critique of anti-Semitism is that the universal principles on which it is based are not trivial and are important to keep in mind. What we might call their cosmopolitan universalism is the starting point of all critical thinking. To be sure, we should not exaggerate the extent of anti-Semitism in Europe to make it appear worse than other racisms. We should not isolate the question of anti-Semitism from more general questions of racism in Europe, or privileged struggles against anti-Semitism over those against other racisms. We should not stigmatize whole collectivities as anti-Semitic, be they Muslims or Arabs or the left itself. We should not deploy memory of the Holocaust for narrow or self-interested political ends, or abuse the language of anti-Semitism to provide a dishonest defense of the Israeli government's occupation of Palestine or human rights abuses. There's every reason to remind ourselves of these universal principles. But who then is the target of the left's critique? Who are the, quote, they, end quote, who are said to be sensitive only to the mass murder of Jews, and not to anyone else, and who shout anti-Semitism every time someone attacks Israel or defends Palestinians? It seems to me that the amorphousness of the, quote, they, its very indeterminacy, where am I? Sorry, something popped up on my screen I had to close. Who are the, quote, they, end quote, who are said to be sensitive only to the mass murder of Jews and not to anyone else, and who shout anti-Semitism every time someone attacks Israel or defends Palestinians? It seems to me that the amorphousness of the, quote, they, its very indeterminacy, is worrying. My experience is that most of us who are actively opposed to anti-Semitism bend over backwards to display our own universalism. For example, to treat the Holocaust not only as an event in Jewish history, but also as an alarm bell warning us of the potential for genocide in the modern world. However, we should also acknowledge that there are individuals and groups opposed to anti-Semitism who more or less fit the picture painted by them of our critics. Within the anti-Semitic camp, let us accept that there are those who think exclusively about Jewish interests, just as within the larger world of anti-racism there are those who respond to racism against, quote, their own, end quote, people, to equally exclusive terms. Indeed, it would be surprising if this were not the case. Nothing can be more natural to cite a much misunderstood passage of Hannah Arendt than that if you are attacked as a Jew, you fight back as a Jew. In this respect, there is little that marks out opposition to anti-Semitism from the general phenomenon that opposition to racism often takes a more or less exclusive form. If you are insulted as a Muslim, an African, or a black person, your instinct is to fight back as Muslim, an African, or a black person. Exclusivity in the battle against racism takes many forms. One may be sensitized to racism against black people but have no feeling for racism against the Irish. So too, one may be sensitized to anti-Semitism but have little concern over what is sometimes called, quote, Islamophobia, end quote. Some people may use the, quote, the, quote, race card, end quote, or the, quote, anti-Semitism card, end quote, opportunistically, to promote their own narrow advantage. But this does not mean that the racism or anti-Semitism in question is not real. It seems to me entirely justified to criticize exclusivity in the way some people confront anti-Semitism, just as it is justified to criticize exclusivity in the way some people have responded, for example, to the racism of the colonial powers in Africa, to the racism of the apartheid regime in South Africa, or to anti-Muslim racism in Europe. It is necessary to be ever alert for the problem of exclusivity in the struggle against racism, and anti-Semitism precisely because particularistic responses are in some sense more natural, more spontaneous, easier than more mediated and reflective forms of universalism. Most people involved in the struggle against contemporary anti-Semitism are well aware that it is wrong to treat all Muslims as anti-Semitic because of the anti-Semitism of certain radical Islamist movements, and that it is wrong to treat all Arabs as anti-Semitic because of the anti-Semitism shown by some Arab states or nationalist parties. However, slippage into a form of, quote, categorical thinking, end quote, which mirrors the racism to which we are opposed, is a constant temptation in this business. We always have to be careful not to invert the problem we are addressing. The temptation we face in confronting anti-Semitism is to represent anti-Semites as inhuman monsters. If anti-Semites dehumanize and demonize Jews, if anti-Semites racialize, quote, the Jews, end quote, into a unitary otherized category, the temptation is to respond with an act of sheer reversal. Footnote, G. Cousin, positioning positionality, the reflexive turn, end footnote. Let me go back to the beginning of that sentence. If anti-Semites dehumanize and demonize Jews, if anti-Semites racialize, quote, the Jews, end quote, into a unitary otherized category, the temptation is to respond with an act of sheer reversal and treat anti-Semites as an equally unitary and otherized category. This reversal does not get us very far down the road of reflectivity or critical understanding. It simply reproduces the notion that one category of human beings is entirely culpable and excludes regard for what we share or could potentially share as complex human beings. The sociologist Raymond Aron once raised an analogous issue in his discussion of Jean-Paul Sartre's Anti-Semite and Jew. Aron argued that Sartre's treatment of the anti-Semite mirrored the anti-Semite's depiction of the Jew. Quote, anti-Semites tend to present all the colonizers, all the anti-Semites, all the whites as essentially defined by their contempt for natives, hatred of Jews, desire for segregation. Anti-Semites paint a portrait of the colonizer, the anti-Semites, or the whites, that is as totalizing as their stereotype of the Jew, the native, or the blacks. The anti-Semite must be wholly anti-Semitic, end quote. Footnote. I don't know, it's in French, but it's by Raymond Aron. Paix et guerre entre les nations. I don't know if that was correct at all, but, gave it a shot. Whether or not Aron was justified in his characterization of Sartre, the issue Aron raises remains of central importance in our own struggle against anti-Semitism. The temptation towards reversal, that is, towards dehumanizing those who are seen as dehumanizing us, must be one of the most intractable problems of political thought. My argument is that it is not wrong to criticize the shortcomings of exclusivist or categorical approaches to confronting anti-Semitism, just as it is not wrong to criticize exclusivist or categorical responses to racism more generally. This, to my mind, is the rational kernel of the radical critique of anti-Semitism. However, it would be wrong to treat exclusivity as the defining feature of the battle against contemporary anti-Semitism. Such a step would slip from a political argument about the limitations of certain forms of opposition to racism and anti-Semitism, which in the language of Paul Gilroy cannot emancipate themselves from, quote, raciological thinking, end quote, to discrediting anti-Semitism as such, as if it alone bore the burden of these shortcomings. Such a slippage would, on the one hand, dovetail with the old anti-Semitic motifs about the exclusiveness of, quote, the Jews, end quote, and, on the other, express a blatant double standard on the part of a left, otherwise committed to the notion that the natural and rational form of opposition to racism is through what it calls the, quote, nationalism of the oppressed, end quote. That is, the nationalism of those who suffer the racism in question. In the case of opposition to anti-Semitism, the radical intelligentsia is prone to denounce what in other instances of anti-racism it idealizes. Clearly, left critics of contemporary anti-Semitism need to be more careful than they are in identifying their target. New anti-Semitism theory is not a unitary camp. Those of us concerned about the rise of a new anti-Semitism in Europe, America, and the Middle East come from a wide spectrum of political opinion, from the more exclusive to the more universal. However, what is also at issue in the left's critique of new anti-Semitism theory is a darkness that lies in the heart of the critics themselves, one that will not admit, come what may, the phenomenon of contemporary anti-Semitism. Sorry, I'm sick. The European left is an anti-racist and anti-Semitic movement that nonetheless has great difficulty in coming to terms with contemporary anti-Semitism. I think we can begin to understand this phenomenon by distinguishing between the more liberal and radical wings. The influence of the radical wing depends very much on the common sense of the world in which that radical wing swims. Emerging within European liberalism is the view that anti-Semitism was indeed a terrible stain on Europe's past, but that anti-Semitism is no longer a major problem in Europe's present. The great liberal temptation is to give the story of European anti-Semitism a happy ending and to pay tribute to the success of the new Europe in transcending the new Europe's longest hatred. Anti-Semitism is safely tucked away in history, overtaken by the defeat of Nazism, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the rise of the European Union. In broad terms, the liberal left tends to associate political anti-Semitism with the period of European nationalisms, and especially the ethnic nationalism that took hold of Germany and much of Eastern Europe. It tends to see the new Europe as marking a radically new period in Europe's history, one that aspires to the formation of a post-national Europe and spells the end of anti-Semitism as we know it. In this reassuring narrative, the liberal left looks back to an era in which anti-Semites saw themselves as guardians of the ethnically pure nation-state, and forwards to a, quote, post-national, end quote, Europe in which anti-Semitism, along with other forms of racism, are remembered only as a residual trauma or museum piece. This way of thinking represents a major shift in European liberal thought. In the past, the progressive liberal consciousness tended to see the new Europe as, quote, bound together by the signs and symbols of its terrible past, end quote. As, quote, forever mortgaged to the past, end quote. The commitment it expressed was to teach afresh Europe's past, not least its violence against black people without and Jews within, to each passing generation, and thus to, quote, furnish Europe's present with admonitory meaning and moral purpose, end quote. Footnote. Tony Judt, Post-War, A History of Europe Since 1945. Today, by contrast, European liberalism is more inclined to recreate a moral division of the world between us and them. Quote, we, end quote, are civilized and post-nationalist. Quote, they, end quote, believe in the purity of the nation and act with corresponding barbarity. The irony of this fake reconstruction of European self-belief is that it presents the European perpetrator as having learned the universal lessons of the Holocaust, while it presents the Jewish victim as having learnt only to reinstate the very malpractices the new Europe has now overcome. Israel plays a particular role in this declining liberal consciousness. This new dichotomy threatens to demonize, quote, Israel, end quote, as the other of an idealized new Europe. It represents Israel as the incarnation of all the negative properties, post-national, that Europe has allegedly thrown off. A racially defined state that denies human rights to those who do not belong to the nation and inclines itself towards ethnic cleansing or even genocide. Quote, Israel, end quote, serves here not as a real country embroiled in real conflicts, but as a vessel into which post-national Europe can project all that is bad in Europe's imperial history and preserve the good for itself. In this sense, Israel now performs a mythic function for a demoralized European liberalism, anxious to divest itself of its own past. Israel becomes a figment of an increasingly impoverished imagination. Within the more radical European left, we see an analogous decline. European racism is treated as a recurring phenomenon, deeply rooted in Europe's colonial experience, and now reinstated in Europe's continuing imperial attachments. In this less than reassuring narrative, there prevails a skeptical view of the whole post-national ideology of the new Europe, which is presented as but another form of imperial relation to the non-Western world. Within this way of thinking, the critique of racism and anti-Semitism gives way to a radical negativity that refuses to recognize any progress in the achievement of anti-racism in post-war Europe. It is as if the practical endeavor to overcome racism has been preempted by a theory that can admit a circulation of different racisms, but not an overcoming of racism itself. However, what the radical left shares with European liberalism is the conviction that anti-Semitism has run its historical course in Europe. That anti-Semitism is always in the past. The radical left declares that it has in the present period given way to new racisms, especially against Muslims, Roma, and black immigrants, and that the race question is no longer whether Jews can be good Germans, good Frenchmen, or good Brits, but whether Muslims, Roma, and black immigrants can be good Europeans. What lies behind this notion, I think, is that Jews are seen as having crossed sides and joined the European white elite. In recent years, the European radical intelligentsia has become increasingly inclined to treat Israel as its primary enemy. Israel is represented as a racist state, a pariah people, an imperial power, the tail that wags the American dog, the extension of colonial Europe into the Middle East, and so forth. The struggle against, quote, Israel, end quote, is made to appear as if it were a struggle against all the old European proclivities to territorial expansion, ethnic cleansing, indifference to the suffering of others, or the careless exercise of gratuitous violence. In this, quote, anti-Zionist, end quote, cause, even the most basic political distinctions can be sacrificed. Distinctions between state and civil society, between reactionary and democratic anti-imperialism, between democracy and fundamentalism. To be sure, the European left continues to avow universal anti-racist principles, but the European left does not expect the same of the victims of racism it supports. For the victims, the European left accepts or even advocates nationalist or fundamentalist forms of resistance that are anything but universal. To the expression of apparently genocidal anti-Semitic sentiments within these forms of resistance, its only response is to ignore, translate, or even justify them. The great temptation of the radical left is to commit its own act of reversal. If certain ultra-nationalists in Israel racialize Arabs and turn Arabs into a unitary, quote, otherized, end quote, category, the radical left's response is to treat, quote, Zionist, end quote, as an equally, quote, otherized, end quote, category, and place Palestinians in a single identity script as victims of Israel. The deeper the compassion for the victims, the more passionate becomes the hatred of the victimizers. Let me add my own rider. I'm not suggesting that Palestinians are not victims, but Palestinians are not only victims, and Palestinians are not only victims of Israel. Let me conclude on this note. It is a worrying view of history that dictates what is and is not possible in a given period. In practical terms, the factual claim that anti-Semitism is no longer a major political problem in Europe excludes it from the list of racisms Europe now has to confront. It illustrates the triumph of what I would call, in the tradition of critical theory, quote, categorical thinking, end quote. That is, thinking that places the category above experience. Today, the decline of the European left in both its liberal and radical forms is such that it does not appear ashamed to make common cause even with Israel's most fundamentalist enemies. The false projection onto, quote, Israel, end quote, of all the defects of ultranationalism does nothing to address the real growth of ultranationalism in many European and Middle Eastern countries, including Israel. Perhaps one ray of light in this worrying time for the European left is that the urgency of this situation might just provide an opening for a less categorical tradition of European critical theory to regain a foothold. The end. Shit. I have to stop.